All right, so resistance, resilience, we know what those are. Moving on. This next set of slides is a trampling study. So this is experimental trampling of grassy forest floor species. So you can see this is an illustration of both resistance to impact, right? At 250 passes in this shaded forested environment, this grass species laid down and within hours sprung back up, and it was ecologically invisible that 250 people had walked past this point, or one poor bastard 250 times, which is how these are actually done, right? But with 1,000 passes, 4 times as much, resistance is now overwhelmed. You're seeing tissue or vascular damage on the plant and like breakage of the grass fronds. So this, 1 month later, after 1,000 passes, this is an illustration or depiction of what resilience looks like, right? A month later, yes, we injured this area, and we created a condition class 1 visitor-created trail through that with 1,000 passes. 1 month later, though, that same season, you don't know. It's, again, ecologically invisible. Now, what behind the scenes this grass has had to do to recover from those impacts is the same kind of stuff that you and I need to do when we are regenerating broken bone tissue, for example. In that case, with bone, it comes back a little bit stronger, right, according to the old wives' tale. But in this case, we've used up some of this plant communities or plant complexes. In the case of rhizomally spreading stuff, we've spent a bunch of the stored starch that we were planning on using this coming winter. So that season, there might be enough resources for this to bounce back and be resilient. The following year's growth season may show some ongoing or latent impact. Okay? So resistance and resilience, that's what it actually looks like. And in borderline, high elevation, low precipitation, low moisture environments, even the rugged turf grass species are kind of barely hanging on, right? So this is well above tree line. This is getting close to the cryo line, meaning permafrost, year-round frozen soils. And so somebody walking across this is at Rocky Mountain National Park up on the highway at 11,000 feet, just past one of the visitor centers. Somebody walking through this grass, right, it doesn't have that 250 or 1,000 pass trampling capacity per day. It's got something much, much less, right? So much shorter growing season, much thinner, much more nutrient depleted soils, right? These grasses are barely able to cling, and we see a lot of accumulating impact over time with that. So that's why Park Service in that previous video had a bunch of signs, don't walk on the grass here, even though we're all used to walking on grass in a more nutrient-rich system, okay? So for things like mosses, like this mountain biking parkour guy is rolling his body across, I don't know what you would call this, non-vascular plants, bryophytes, mosses, that sort of thing, extremely fragile, right? Associated with high soil moisture, saturated soils, and the soft, non-woody growth form doesn't repel or resist trampling impacts much at all, okay? So that's just gonna be a limitation of that kind of, or that class of plants. Shifting from grasses to forbs, so things like ferns and broadleaf plants, we're gonna see less resistance, right? So this is looking pretty trashed after 250 passes, and less resilience, right? So after 1,000 passes and leaving a month for regeneration, for regrowth later in that season to happen, forbs just don't do as well, right? So we're snapping off more fronds, crushing the tissue of the plant much more effectively than with grassoids, which just prostrate and spring back up. This effect is even more pronounced as we get into woody forest 4 forest floor cover. So low bushy plants like low bush blueberry at Acadia from summer camp, 1 or 2 passes through that and you can see that, and those are permanent impacts. It's not going to regrow those particular branches. All right, dry shrubs. Action Jackson. Those poor plants. They have no idea what's coming. So, the size of the vegetative organism has everything to do with, are you going to drive your dune buggy or your modified four-wheeler over it? Or are you going to cut the wheel hard and try to avoid it? So, we want to say that mature trees, for example, and large shrubby, so multi-stem, ground sprouting stuff, very large versions, people are going to go around it. If it has thorns, people are going around it. If it is smaller, like it looks like I could push it sideways and just walk through it, that's what a visitor is typically going to do when they're traveling cross country. And we're going to see a lot more impacts with that. So, tree seedlings, extremely low resistance, extremely low resilience. Tree saplings, high resistance, low resilience. Mature trees, high resistance, high resilience, except for shallow rooting species like giant sequoia and coastal redwoods. Okay, so we have to consider size, moisture content, nutrient availability, growth form, adaptations like thorns, for example, and what on the human side, the behavioral, the motivational side, right? If the only trees you see are very occasional mesquites in a sparse woodland environment out west, so mostly grassland, for example, those few trees are going to get picked over pretty hard and even cut down prematurely to try and make somebody's low-quality campfire. All right, so firewood gathering is prohibited around a lot of campsites for this specific reason, because when we take the nutrients represented by that downed branch or that standing green wood, and we burn it in the fire, it is no longer available to that nutrient limited area. So there's a sort of a increasing concentric ring effect of range from the center of a campsite to how just utterly nutrient depauperated the forest is around that spot in nutrient limited forests like boreal forests in coastal Alaska, for example. You can absolutely almost straight up sterilize an area by gathering firewood in an Alaskan forest in some cases, which blows people's minds, and they get mad that they can't have a warm campfire in Alaska where it's rainy and wet and so forth, cold, even in the summer. But you gotta help them understand, look, you can kill off this forest by making that fire, by starving it to death. It's pretty metal. So, submature trees in the sapling phase, around campsites we're gonna see a lot of this. People taking those lower branches, anything below about 6 feet high, and snapping them off and bringing them back to that campfire. Now, for some tree species, as you know, lower, earlier limbs become biologically dormant. Some few species even start to drop limbs that are lower and not helping with the cause by leafing out. But that is not most tree species, and so we're looking at a lot of tree injuries, open wounds in the structural tissue of the tree from people snapping off or sawing off or hatcheting off branches for firewood. This is the same story everywhere all over the world for all of time since the invention of fire, so as boring as it is, we talk a lot about firewood gathering in terms of ecology impacts. All right, mature trees, good to go. As long as a coastal redwood that is very, very shallow rooting, they're so big, they don't want to put down real deep tap roots. They need to grows sideways almost exclusively in order to interlock their roots with the entire rest of that grove of coastal redwoods so that when the hard winds come, they don't all get pushed over. Right? With the square cube rule of the strength of the tree in resisting wind increases with the square, the cross-sectional area, the thickness of the trunk. But the mass that that tree has to support increases with the cube of the width of the tree. There's a diminishing return in how much bigger a tree can get and how much stronger can it get while getting bigger. So we see that, oddly, surprisingly, coastal redwoods and giant sequoia are so big that they're actually more vulnerable to human trampling impact because we can compact all the soil around those very shallow-rooted, enormous roots and the root hairs that are trying to gather water and nutrients from the soil. And in this way, the General Sherman tree was almost killed off by people on the National Park Service's watch. So they had to really redo how they were doing that. They put a big boardwalk up to some of these trees to physically completely separate people from the soil. No soil compaction, no root loss, and healthy giant sequoias and coastal redwoods. Pretty cool, but it was a surprising thing. So they went and in it was either Muir Woods, maybe Sequoia Kings Canyon, they've actually removed entire campgrounds that were over a century old in some of these real famous spots, some of these real famous groves, because even just putting a tent on the ground and having people sleep there, 150 nights a year during the peak season was enough to compact the soil and start killing off these massive 1,500-year-old trees. So we pay attention to how shallow or deeply things are rooting. All right, we've already talked about deadwood, seen that video, moving on. Let's end on this for Thanksgiving. We'll think about this. We'll just have a moment of deep thoughts with Jack Handy. All right, cool. I'm around for questions if you have them. We'll finish off vegetation stuff when we come back and start wrapping up our semester. I'm around for questions in the meantime.